I welcome everyone here and everyone in cyberspace to another episode of Wednesday Night Live. The class is dedicated by Spencer Schneider in honor of everyone who gets uplifted by this class. That's a nice dedication, which we shall hopefully do. You see, a spirit, as opposed to matter, if you look at the universe in a two-dimensional fashion where everything is made up of a body and a soul, or more using physics language, scientific language, matter and energy, or matter and spirit. So the key distinction between anything that is material and anything that is spiritual is that the spirit, as compared to a flame, is always gravitating upwards. And the matter, like the wick, grounds and gravitates downward. So there's like that story they tell about one of the Rebbes when he was a young child. He was playing on a ladder with friends, with other children. They were climbing a ladder, as children do. And all the kids were experimenting and trying to climb a few rungs up the ladder, scampering back down. And this particular child was the only one that had the courage to climb all the way to the top of the ladder. And later, when his grandfather, who was a great Hasidic Rebbe, asked him, so why is it that you were different than the other kids? What made you have the ability to climb all the way to the top and the others didn't? So he answered simply, you say Zayda in Yiddish is grandpa. He answered, because when the other children climbed, they kept looking down, so they saw how high they were. They were afraid to climb higher. When I was climbing, I kept looking up. So I saw how low I was, and it motivated me to climb higher. So we all have these two options how to look at life. To look up, ahead, to what has not yet been accomplished, what can still be accomplished. Or to look back and look down to what already has been accomplished. So you'll see that when people hang around with others that are less accomplished than you are, you'll always find that it does not tend to motivate you to grow. On the contrary, it makes you feel, look how much I've done compared to them. But when you hang around people who have achieved more than you have, so there is that type of competitive edge, the competitive drive that makes you feel, look how much they've accomplished, more than I have, and it drives you to feel motivated to grow. It's called in Hebrew, there's an expression, kinat sofrim tarba chachma, which means the healthy envy of wise people, of colleagues, adds in wisdom. Because when you're with a colleague that has accomplished more than you, it can translate into a healthy form of motivation, which is a healthy form of envy. So in life today, everyone I'm sure had a long day, hard day, not today, yesterday, and each day brings its own challenges. In life, you'll have two things happening, one or the other, and there's no third option. Either the day has uplifted you higher, uplifted you, or it's brought you down. I remember the first time I ever went to a business meeting, and I don't go to many of them, but the first one I remember in our office and so on. A meeting is an interesting phenomenon. When you're a little child, you don't go to meetings, and suddenly one day you turn into an adult and there's meetings. And I'm sure they have plenty of value, because meetings, synergy, as they tell us, comparing notes, trial and error, checks and balances, and so on, planning, creating a team effort. But I remember one meeting which was particularly annoying. So a guy that seemed to have a lot of experience with it, he said to me, look, I've been to thousands of meetings in my life. Remember, there's only two ways a meeting can go. It either drains you or it empowers you. And you'll know just by how you feel at the end which one it was. And that's how you know whether it was successful or not. So I think in life as well, we have the two experiences in life. Either things are draining us and continuously challenging us, or they are inspiring us and empowering us. And there's no third option. Because the third option, you could say, well, it's neither empowering nor draining. That's usually draining. Because the bottom line is you've invested time and energy, and time has passed and nothing came out of it. So if you don't get stronger from it, what happened? You lost the time, you lost the energy. So hopefully, and this is my mission and objective with this weekly get-together that's going on now for many, many years. I won't tell you how many, but many years, suffice it to say, several decades, going back to the previous century. It sounds ancient. It's the 20th century, that is. And I've been taught and trained, and I hope I achieve some of this, is I try to not drain people, but empower them. Now, when I say I don't mean me as a person necessarily, only as an individual, but more importantly, in a larger sense of things, a larger context, it's what you're here for. You know, when you meet people, you hear sometimes you meet some people who are called high-maintenance people. People who need constant attention, they're needy, and they take a lot of energy from you. They can drain you. Then there are people you meet when it's a pleasure, because not only don't they drain you, you always feel stronger after speaking to them. So I would like to believe that each of us has that choice, and it would be interesting exercise, maybe a little sobering, and maybe even worse than that. So you do it with discretion, to check out with your friends whether you are a drainer or you're a empowerer. Now, I don't know how many people are going to be honest with you. You know, how many friends do we have that are going to say, you know, you just drain me every time we speak. But if you're really looking for an honest answer, I'm sure you'll be able to get one. And I guess that alone is already somewhat of an antidote. Because if you are draining some people, just by asking the question and humbling yourself to that point, it would be interesting. That itself, as I said, could end up causing you to look at yourself in a new way. So we do have this choice. And it's very much the theme of our discussion this evening, about how how we can exercise that choice, and that we're not victims, and we really have the ability to turn on different switches in our lives. Now, why do some people feel that sense of entitlement, that they can just spend their time taking, and draining others, and others feel the opposite, that they are here to serve and to help? And obviously, extremes are always never healthy. There always has to be a balance. I deal with this a lot, especially in personal consultations with people. You know, how you balance taking care of your own needs and helping others. You know, we find extremes like sometimes some of us who grew up in very dysfunctional or it's called non-nurturing environments and homes. So when you weren't loved and unconditionally, and weren't given and served and provided for with your needs, there comes a point in your own healing process where you go the other extreme, where you say, no one takes care of me, I'll take care of myself. And then you can go to the real other extreme, which is complete self-absorption, with the excuse or the justification that, look, 20 years of my life, I was a shmata being used by others, and I was completely neglected. So now is my time to take care of myself. So there may be truth to that to some extent. Some of us, when you're deprived and you're hungry, you sometimes need to compensate. But obviously, as I said, every extreme is not healthy, because then you tend to become the other extreme. You end up doing to others what was done to you, not nurturing anyone else, not showing any love and care to another, with the justification because you weren't taken care of. So the vicious cycle continues. And then there's the other extreme, people who are constantly serving others, and they do forget and neglect themselves. So you have Hillel's classic statement where he says both in one sentence, in one phrase, he says, Im einani li mili, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? Clearly stating and declaring the need for a person to have a sense of self and taking care of that self and feeling strong with yourself. But then there's the second half where he says, Im ani la'atzmi ma'ani, if I'm only for myself, what am I? Which means that complete self-containment or self-absorption is equally unhealthy, because we're part of a unit. We're part of a society. We're part of a community, of a family, whatever word you use for it. And there we have to recognize that we are not alone. No man is an island unto himself, and we are in need of others, and they're in need of us. And in that context, we can't just create a complete insulation of einani limili, just being me and myself, but there's a need to complement a certain synergy that is created through the more than the sum of the parts, a type of synergy that we each provide for each other. And of course, I use this analogy constantly because it's such, I believe it's such an excellent analogy for this, that this is, even though it may sound like a contradiction, it's not, this paradox is very much part of what makes life life. Take music, for example. Any musical composition has this paradox in full glory, where every musical note has to play its sound, its note. At the same time, every note is aware of and needs all the other notes for it to be music. Any work of art is what we call harmony within diversity, which means it has many components, and each component is specifically not a clone of another. Each has its own boundaries and its own contribution and its own unique qualities and virtues. At the same time, that doesn't contradict the fact that each needs the other. So where do we have a mess? Where does it get screwed up? It gets screwed up when there is a breakdown of boundaries, where either what is being compromised is your individuality, or what's being compromised is how you are synergizing and synchronizing yourself with others. And that's, of course, the art of balance, the art of a dance, of what makes true beauty in this world. Beauty is always harmony and diversity working hand in hand. If you get rid of the diversity, you lose the beauty. If you get rid of the harmony, you lose the beauty. So think of it, a bunch of musical notes jumbled up the wrong way. It's just noise. It's chaos. So you need all those different noise sounds, but you need them in the right order. So that is what's called in Hebrew tiferet, beauty. It's harmony. The color blue may be very beautiful. The color red may be beautiful. One musical note may be a beautiful note, but alone, it's just monotonous. Beauty is never one-dimensional. Everything beautiful, we call beautiful, will always be a combination of different forces that have confluence of these forces positioned in the right harmonic order. That's called beauty. You say a beautiful face, it doesn't mean one aspect of the face is beautiful. There's some combination of the eyes, the mouth, the nose, the complexion, the balance. That is called beauty. I mean, it's been analyzed and studied. Beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. But there are objective elements of beauty that even children who have not yet been conditioned or programmed respond to. You play music that is in harmony, a child responds with a gentleness. Play that music backwards, and you'll see the child will jolt backward. What's the word for it? Will be repulsed. It's not the word I'm looking for, but it'll suffice. So finding balance in life, of knowing how to balance spirit and matter, as I began the discussion here, of when to aspire to something greater and when to ground yourself, is one of the greatest challenges in life. And it's actually the theme of this week's Torah portion. As those of you familiar with these classes know, that my focus I'd say exclusively, is not so much getting into the intricate details of all the commentaries and counter-commentaries and all the arguments that you can go on forever in every particular verse in the Torah. If you ever went to yeshiva and studied any verse in the Bible with commentaries, you know what I'm talking about. Especially if you study Talmud, literally the fine print and every legal nuance possible in every situation, which has its value. But the focus here is rather on the spiritual and personal relevance of these ideas. To put it bluntly, who cares? Why should we care about what these stories have to tell us? Stories that happened thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, different part of the planet, different time, different part of history, different challenges. There's almost nothing similar to what is going on in today's world than was going on 3,321 years ago. It's exactly that amount when this chapter takes place. Yet, for those that dig deeper and understand the Torah not just as a biblical text, but as a blueprint for life, and I use that word very, very deliberately, because that's what the Medrash says. It's a blueprint, like an architect, before you build a structure, first creates and writes a blueprint, which is in a microcosm, concentrated form, the entire structure. Or if you do it, or in writing, it's called an outline. Or in other forms, it's called a skeleton, some type of framework. So too God created the universe in that fashion, the Torah being God's blueprint. So in a sense, if you want to have the operator's manual of life, that's what the Torah is. So just like you bring home a new gadget, or a new whatever it may be, iPhone, iPad, this, that, it comes along with a manual, an operator's manual, which tells you what makes this machine work and what makes it not work. And if you're particularly more technical oriented, there's probably manuals that go more deeper into the inner workings and that make this piece of technology function. Some people love to read these manuals, some people hate to read them. It doesn't really matter. The bottom line is the manuals are a reflection or documentation of the creator, inventor, or builder of this particular machine. So if you think of the universe and life as a machine, and it's clearly a machine with rules and in a sense permanent rules, etched in stone, the rules of nature, the scientific laws of existence. So here too there is a manual that gives us an X-ray, or you can say a CAT scan of the divine, the cosmic engineer that put it in place. So if you look at the Torah that way, it takes on a whole different meaning. It's not a Torah made up of, it's not a book made up of stories and inspirations and poetry and history and so on. It's actually a fundamental spiritual blueprint of life. And every character, episode, detail, down to every detail, comes to really give us an image, a reflection of what are we like, an X-ray of our souls. So you may, of course, wonder then why is that not taught in any schools? That would be quite intriguing. Well, don't worry about the question, because I had the same question myself. I went to yeshiva system and it wasn't taught. You have to conclude that the people teaching either don't know it or they don't know how to teach it. But that's another discussion which I won't go into for now. The bottom line is that it is fundamentally a psychological, spiritual blueprint for life. And it's not something that is a modern fabrication. Anyone, if you study the inner dimension of the Torah, which is called Primis Torah, the soul of Torah, the Zohar, which is a book that goes back over 2,000 years, says that the Torah breaks into two parts, like a body and a soul. So there's the Gufa Dara, the body of Torah, and there's the soul of the Torah. The body of the Torah, like the body of a human being, is mechanics. The mechanics of the entity. And the soul of an entity is its inner workings. Most of us, those that are familiar with Torah, are mostly familiar with the body of Torah, at best. The soul of Torah is a best kept secret, you can say. But when you start studying and looking into it, you realize the profound relevance and realize the mystery of why the Torah is still here today. No way that an operator's manual of some technology of 3,000 years ago would still be relevant today. It's only because that operator's manual still resonates because it remains the architect's document of how we tick, you and I. And in that sense, there is no difference between human beings today and thousands of years ago. They needed love then, and we need love today. They cried then, and we cry today. They had questions, philosophical and psychological quandaries. We have psychological and philosophical quandaries. So when you really transcend geography and place and time and get into the heart and essence of what makes a human being, frankly, it doesn't matter how many thousands of years have passed. Humans are humans. And they needed relationships then, and we need relationships today. So to be able to dig beyond the surface of the Torah and get into its inner dimension, understand its relevance, is both an exhilarating and very extremely relevant and eye-opening experience. Because you suddenly realize truths that resonate. It's like music that you hear. As I'll share now some ideas in this week's chapter, and you tell me it's not something my interpretation. What I will be sharing here is based on documents that come from the soul interpretation of this portion. So briefly, the story may be known to some of you. The mechanical part of the story is this. In the second year after the Jews left Egypt, So we know they're going through the wilderness on their way to the promised land. At that point, actually, they were about to be in the promised land within a few months, or maximum a year or two. Because how long does it take to walk from Egypt to Israel? I know it's not overnight, but it's not 40 years either. But something happens. Moses sends, at the beginning of this, opening of this chapter, Moses sends a group of scouts, called meraglim, spies or scouts. He chooses the leaders of each tribe. So these are the 12 greatest people of their generation to be the scouts that go out and check out the promised land. So they go ahead and they make their way into Israel, basically to check out what this land, what's going on. Because remember, the time when Jacob left Israel with the 70 souls to go to Egypt because of the great famine, we're now over 200 years later. The Jews were 210 years in exile. So it's 2 centuries, over 2 centuries. And no Jew was ever allowed out of Egypt, so no one knew what was going on in Israel. You know, who had occupied their territories, who had occupied their homes, meaning the land that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had bought and had settled. And since they were on their way back to the promised land, it made sense to Moses that he should send scouts, Shelach lecha anashim. So he sent these scouts to go check it out, to see what's the best way, as the Ramban Nachmanides explains, what's the best way to enter the land. And if there will have to be a war, what's the best way to fight any battles? Now remember, legally, it was the Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their children that owned a big part of this land. So the scouts go and fulfill their mission, so to speak, or seemingly so. But here's where things get messed up. They come back with a terrible report. The words of the Bible in this chapter is that they slander the land. They slander the land. They speak badly about the promised land. And what do they say? They say, we saw giants. We see a very powerful nations that are now living in Israel, in the promised land. And here's their key line. And it's impossible for us to enter and conquer this land. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants, too powerful for us to enter. And being that they were so credible as leaders, and besides the fact that Moses chose to send them, so clearly they had strong influence, because that's why they went. And what happens is they create a major mutiny in this chapter, where the entire people, the entire nation rises up against Moses and says, why have you brought us here? We're stuck here in the desert. We're no longer in Egypt. Let's go back to Egypt. 2 of these 12 people that were sent, however, Joshua and Caleb, had a different position, a different report. Their position was, their words are, the land is it's a very, very good land. They used the word ma'id twice. An exceedingly precious country. And with faith in God and God's promises, we definitely can enter and conquer the land. But at this point, the damage was done. So the nation wants to kill them, was about to kill them, when God finally intercedes. And extremely upset, of course, at what's going on here. Because here, the whole Bible is about the promised land. From day one when Abraham began his journey, and all the hundreds and hundreds of years, it was all about ultimately going back to our promised land, the Holy Land. And here, the entire nation basically feels that it's too dangerous or it's too destructive, that they will not be able to prevail over a land that consumes its inhabitants. That's the word that the scouts use, that phrase. Eretz echeles yishvel, land that consumes its inhabitants. Without going to all the details of the end of the story, the bottom line is Moses prays on behalf of the nation and has God forgive them, but not without any collateral damage. As a result of their so-called mutiny and challenge to God's promise, God says, okay, you don't want to go into the land, I will grant you a request. And every person that had left Egypt and that is here now complaining about this land will never enter this promised land. You will die in the desert. And it will be your children that will enter. Except two people, Caleb and Joshua, because they accepted the challenge. So of all, and that's exactly what happens. Every one of that generation died, including Moses. Which is like an extremely sad story, because these are people who came out of Egypt. They had seen the worst. But then they decreed upon themselves. They brought it upon themselves. They said they can't conquer it. So God says, okay, be careful what you ask for. And they got what they asked for. They never entered the land. Which is a story of its own, but also connected to the main focus I want to address here is this. What exactly happened here? Very bizarre story. First of all these people knew when they left Egypt, and when they entered Egypt, they knew the promises made to Abraham from the beginning of time, that the land of Israel would be the promised land, and this would be the Holy Land where the Jews would end up going. They knew why they left Egypt, and suddenly they get frightened by a bad report. I mean, they had seen greater miracles. The great Egyptian superpower was humbled. And many other things that happened. Why suddenly are they afraid? And what's going on with these scouts? They were not simple people. They were leaders. It says, Rashi says, that they were true, holy, great people. Both handpicked by Moses. So what happened with them exactly? They come in, they see big fruits, and some tall people, and they suddenly get intimidated. They even use an expression which is like essentially a profoundly psychological one, what we call today projection. They said, "Vayinu beinenu beineihem kechagovim, v'chein hayinu beineihem." I'm sorry, v'hayu beineinu. We saw, when we looked at these great giants in the land, we saw ourselves as small insects, grasshoppers. And that's how we appear to them as well. This is the expression used. The obvious question is, it goes the other way around. If you were actually shorter and small insects compared to them, what it means you appeared that way to yourself, and that's how you also appear to them. But this, in essence, is projection. When you lose confidence in yourself, then others also begin to see you as weak. If this was an objective statement, they should have simply said, we're 5 feet tall, we're 6 feet tall, they're 20 feet tall. And that's it, it's an objective reality. They didn't put it that way. They said, we felt that way. We felt like we were small in our own eyes. And therefore, we also appeared that way to them. This will be relevant in the context of this discussion here. So what happened? That such great people should suddenly lose their faith. So one fundamental explanation is, and this is where the relevance starts to emerge, is that this question that they addressed was not just a question of fear of some giants or fear of the power of those that occupied or inhabited the land of Israel. They were addressing a deeply psychological and philosophical dilemma that all great thinkers and all spiritual seekers have always addressed. But here's maybe the first documented story. What they were saying was, and here's their words, listen to their words, it's a land that consumes its inhabitants. They were basically referring to the overwhelming power of materialism. Here we are in a wilderness, insulated and isolated from civilization, from the marketplace. Very conducive to spiritual growth. Simple. We surrounded by the clouds of glory. We get man from heaven, bread from heaven. They lived a very comfortable life, even though it was a wilderness, but they were protected. And now we suddenly look at the world that we have to enter. It's a materialistic world. Here we will have to work hard, struggle with making a living. Why should anyone that is of spiritual nature want to leave a spiritual oasis to enter into a Wall Street, to the corruption and to the forces that demand of us conformity and all the other pressures that every one of us knows what happens when you have to make a living and when you need money and you're dependent on others? How many compromises have we made in our lives as a result? Probably more than we could ever imagine. Just think of your own idealism when you were a little younger. I don't want to depress anybody, but why not? Just to make the point, since the part of the story is depressing. There's a happy ending, so don't worry about that either. Think about the idealism that you once had, and then, as we call it, we became realistic. That's how some people call it. And then when you see a young person who's idealistic, you roll with your eyes or you smile. You don't want to burst their bubble. You come into the real world, and it's not what the word dreamy-eyed as it appears initially. So in essence, the scouts were basically saying what each person really experiences in life, which is a point where the land consumes its inhabitants. Who has not been consumed by the material pressures of life, by existential loneliness, by all the other forces? I'm not even going to go through the whole list, but but you can include everything: the search for healthy relationships, the disappointments, the broken promises, the naivete, and later so-called becoming, losing your innocence, as they say. I mean, this whole list is all part of the experience of a land that consumes us. And the question is, what remains intact, and can something remain intact? So what the scouts were asking actually was a gift, giving us a gift. They were asking the question that every one of us should ask and must ask. And as I said earlier, thinkers and philosophers have always been challenged by this question. Can you maintain spiritual, moral integrity in a material world or not? And there are extreme positions on this matter. You'll find some, especially the more cynical and the more anarchist approach, that absolutely not. It's a ridiculous fantasy that people even think that they can maintain any integrity. That may disturb some of us, but there are definitely thinkers that write this in a very open fashion, especially in the last few hundred years, the result of the Enlightenment, that we're basically beasts who have dressed ourselves up in garments and trappings that sound ethical. But if you take a very hardcore Darwinian and Freudian look at human psyche, we are animals at heart. The id, in the words of Freud, in Darwin's words, maybe the animal within. I don't know if that's the exact word he uses. But we are basically, our driving engine and force is survival of the fittest, perpetuating ourselves. And that's absolute selfishness. And that's reality, period. However, because coexistence requires cooperation, or else we'll all just end up killing each other, so evolution plays its own tricks on how we become so-called docile and more domesticated, and create rules, superimpose rules, green lights and red lights, to basically allow ourselves not to destroy each other. And that too is selfish. There are books like Dawkins' Selfish Gene or others that make the radical argument that everything is driven by selfishness. Sometimes selfishness dresses up in altruism because that's what it needs to survive. Because altruistic people are respected, and therefore their genes have more chance of perpetuating. I know it sounds cold-hearted, and actually it is cold-hearted, but this is not a marginalized theory today. This is considered to be prevalent contemporary biology. The forces that shape who we are and what is our essential driving engines. Now that I'm obviously presenting it maybe in the most extreme fashion, but there definitely exists this theory, and then there are moderations of it, variations of it that are more moderate forms of this approach. On the other end of the spectrum, well, let me just finish the sentence then. So from this perspective, the only way, well, actually, it's a fantasy to believe that the land will not consume its inhabitants. The land will consume its inhabitants. And the question is only who will survive. And the strongest will survive, the fittest will survive. On the other end of the spectrum, you find those that call the mystical approach, especially in Far Eastern thinking, where the entire material world is an illusion. Whether it's a physical illusion or an actual illusion or an intellectual illusion, there are many schools of thought there too. And the ultimate goal is to find a spiritual place where you can survive and live. And the challenge of the material universe, the distraction and the seduction of the material universe, is the battle we have to fight. But our goal is to reach some type of spiritual consciousness, higher consciousness. And that is why the only way to do so, according to that extreme, is to isolate yourself and insulate yourself. Whether it's a monastic lifestyle or a ascetic lifestyle, separate yourself from the tug of war that exists in the marketplace, that's driven by greed, by selfishness, by vanity, and all those vices that distract us from finding our souls. And there specifically, one has to separate yourself from that world, from the material world that is, in order to achieve spiritual peace of mind. And that is what's advocated. And there are people, including the Western world, including the United States, whether it's a result of getting burned out or it's a result of just spiritual curiosity, did take to the mountains, so to speak, and chose to live a life of separating themselves from the material marketplace challenges and find that type of spiritual oasis. Even in the Bible you find, for instance, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all chose to be shepherds, as did Jacob's sons, the tribes. They were all shepherds. That wasn't an accident, because a shepherd, in a way, is somewhat separates himself from, as I said, Wall Street of the time. And sheep are very docile creatures. So a shepherd basically meditates, prays, connects to higher consciousness. It's Joseph, the first person in the Bible that is thrust into a so-called marketplace material world, is Joseph. So first he becomes an accountant, first Jewish accountant, and then he becomes the vice president, the viceroy, second in command to Pharaoh, and the one that actually runs the entire grain industry that turned Egypt into a superpower. So the scouts actually, if you think about it, were really right. Their argument was a very powerful argument. Yes, God promised the land to us. Yes, everybody was waiting for it. But now that we see it, they came back and said, it's not like we don't want the promised land. It's too powerful. The tug of materialism will overwhelm our spiritual sensibilities, and we will not be able to survive. So their intention was a very spiritual one, actually. And precisely because they were leaders and giants in their own right, that they were able to look at it this way, because they saw it from a philosophical point of view. It wasn't just fright, it was a philosophical dilemma. It was basically leaning toward the spiritual mystical approach, which is that the material world is a challenge, and it's not something we can handle. And then there are the schools of thought, which we shall discuss soon, in between these two extremes. So the question now is the other way around. So what was wrong with what they said? Why was it a sin? They were coming from a pure place. Their intentions were pure. They weren't gaining anything from slandering the promised land. It was coming for good reasons. They were warning the people of what lies ahead, the power of materialism. So what was wrong? Why was it such a grave sin? That actually was the first Tisha B'Av. It caused the Jews to cry. And God says, you cried tonight. It was Tisha B'Av. That was when this happened. I'll give you something to cry about. It becomes the weeping for generations, that on this same night would be all the destructions in Jewish history. The temple, expulsion from Spain, and all the other things the Talmud documents of what happened on this day, and this sad day. So here's the answer. The answer is, no one ever asked the scouts to come to any type of conclusion based on their logic whether you can or cannot enter the land and conquer it. They were asked one thing and one thing only: how you conquer the land. What they tampered with, which was why their sin was so grave, was they went into the domain that only God controls, and that is why we exist in the first place. According to the scouts, if you take the logic to the farthest logical conclusion, we should also all commit suicide, God forbid, or choose not to enter this world. Because a soul in heaven, before it comes into a physical body and is born on this planet, is in a spiritual oasis as well. So if you ask the scouts whether a soul should come down to this earth, their answer would be absolutely no. The challenge is too great. So they were tampering with the mere fact that God says, I sent you to this earth, and I send you to the promised land, and I know it's a material world, and still I send you empowered with the tools to be able to handle it. And that was their grave sin. Their argument is a fine argument. You could argue all day, how do you maintain spiritual integrity in a material world? But no one gave you the right to conclude that we cannot enter. Basically, they were asked how, not whether. When you're sent on a mission, you're asked to figure out how to do it. And you come back and say, we can do it, you've crossed the line between what you were sent for and into what is not in your control. The fact that we live in this earth, and our souls came into this material world, and all of us have challenges, some of us more than others, is not in our control. That's God's decision to give you life, each of us here, and we're born into this world. Is it pleasant? No, life can be very unpleasant. At times you can wonder, why am I here? Is it worth it? But the bottom line is, we have no right to ask whether we should be here or not. What we have to figure out and ask ourselves is, how do we make our way? How do we preserve our souls? How do we conquer the land? Not how do we shrink away from the fear that the land will consume its inhabitants. And that's where the scouts went wrong. And that was their big mistake. Had they come back and said, it's difficult, and it's challenging, but here's some ways that we can maneuver, that's exactly what they were sent for. They didn't do that. The fear of materialism paralyzed them, and that basically challenged God himself. Because it's God that put us into this world. It's God that sends a person to this material life. We still don't have an answer to the question how to do it, but I'm just explaining here what the story with the scouts is. What we see from this is that the entire story of this chapter is actually the story of our own lives. Each of us here, in our own way, has our own particular challenges with the land. The land has consumed every person in some way or another. If not today, tomorrow. Does it have to consume us? Absolutely not. But it does. And the real ultimate story here is, what do we do about it? Because remember, the scouts alert us to the fact that this is a difficult life. But the solution at the end of the day is, Joshua and Caleb were the ones that were right. They said that you stand strong and connected, and you will be able to enter this promised land. And that's why they were the only two that actually entered. The rest, essentially, as I said earlier, testified and reached their own verdict by saying they couldn't do it. So now the question is, so how? Doesn't it seem more logical to take the approach that I mentioned earlier of the mystics, that one should live an ascetic lifestyle? You want to be spiritual? Fine. But no way that you can do it with a 9-to-5 job and with all the pressures of life in the material world. Simple as that. So here we do have different philosophers and thinkers that try to figure out, how do you balance the two? But everybody ultimately fails in true balance. At best, you find, for instance, which is maybe the most contemporary approach that is not as extreme as the two extremes of what I called before Darwinian, Freudian extremism, or let's call it religious or spiritual extremism. You find that in most cases, most of us, especially in the Western world, find balance through what we'll call compartmentalization. What does that mean? Let's speak very, very basically. We all are made up of two parts, at least, body and soul. One part of our lives demands and needs certain things for survival. And a very basic level. We need to eat, to drink, to sleep, relationships. We need clothing, shelter. The whole list of items that is basically necessities to survive in this world. They're not necessarily things we need to love. Some of us love them, some don't love them, but they're necessities. And they happen to consume most of our day. They say a third of our lives we're asleep. I don't mean spiritually, physically. 7 years of a person's life is spent in the men's room or ladies' room. That's what it says. Statistics. That's a lot of time, I know. Then take into account commuting, shopping, buying shoelaces, tying shoelaces. Then that eats up another part of the day. And then, of course, there's work itself, your work. Whatever hours that you work. And still we have time for television and newspapers and online, internet. I mean, the numbers are astounding. The average time a person spends, you think there was only 24 hours, where did we get the time? But clearly we always have some extra time. So if you think about it purely on that level, and including entertainment, I didn't even mention relationships and therapy and agonizing and all that. Just those things I mentioned really gobble up and eat up most of our day and night. If you throw in our psychological challenges, as I said, relationships, healing, getting sick, and then healing again, and then the whole cycle, there doesn't seem to be any time left for anything else. But there's definitely another need that every one of us has. All of us. No one is excluded. And that is, I'll call it a transcendental need. We all have a need to transcend all of this, I don't want to use the word garbage of our lives, if you wish. We need to transcend and find something that's a little beyond the monotony of the daily routine. How do we satisfy our transcendent needs? That can be through love, romance, music, art, travel, religion, faith, spirituality, reading, and even socializing to some extent. Obviously, there are areas where overlap between our material lives and our so-called transcendental life. But it's clearly two different departments. With the first one occupying most of our time and the transcendental having very little time. So what we do is we compartmentalize. How do we balance the two? We can't quit our jobs because you need to pay your bills. Without paying your bills, you'll have a whole new set of problems. So what we do is we compartmentalize. Most of the day, most of the time is spent on survival, or variations of it, or extensions of survival. And compartmentalizing weekends, evenings, mornings, whatever, times that we carve out, that we designate to something that satisfies some type of higher aspiration. That's what most of us do. What's wrong with that? You could argue, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is, first of all, the problem has not been resolved. You just, it's called damage control, meaning the best you can do under the circumstances. So you ultimately have two worlds: your material life and your soulful, your soulful life. When I say soulful, I don't necessarily mean it in a religious context. I just mean anything that is not of the tangible sensory world, but is a clear need in each of our lives. And yes, we do have constant conflict between home and career, between our commitments and our relationships and our own personal aspirations. There's constant struggle, constant battle. But we negotiate. We negotiate our way through, like a minefield, and try to create some type of sanity. Does it work? That's arguable. I personally think it doesn't work at all. But we get used to it, and like we can get used to anything, even things that don't work. Because remember, the toll that it takes on us is hard to measure. How much of our personal anxieties and fears and insecurities grows out of this tension between these two worlds? We may not like to acknowledge it, but that's where it may be coming from. Because remember, psychologically speaking, when a person does not have a unified force, so we know human beings abhor chaos. Even people who, what we call disorganized, they don't think they're disorganized. They just think their organization is different than other people's organization. You know, I've seen people with offices, and they have desks that have papers all the way almost to the ceiling. And if you say to them, how do you manage this? They say, what's the problem? I know exactly where everything is. And you ask them for something, sometimes they literally can find it within a few seconds. And if not, okay, it's part of the process is to search a little. We all do have to do some search. Now we're going to get into the order and organization of our computers, where the illusion is, you know, it's all a little box, so how cluttered could it get? But we all know how cluttered it can get. What's the most amount of time you've searched for retrieve a document? Anybody? Any records there? So there's a toll that this takes on us because human beings crave and gravitate toward unity. And what I just described is maybe the best of the worst options, but it's still not an option of what's called integration. It's compartmentalization. So psychologically, that takes a toll on us, no question about it, because fragmentation and compartmentalization has to drain us. Philosophically speaking, there's also a problem because from a Jewish perspective, the most famous prayer dictates Hashem Echad, that God is one. But God is one does not mean there's one God and not many gods. God is one means there's one reality and not many realities. So unity is ultimately the ultimate goal in any true spiritual journey. So from a spiritual perspective, there's a fundamental problem here. What do you do with this material world? So the ascetic would say, you just separate for yourself from it. But God created it, and God made it very clear, as you see from the story of the scouts, that that's not an option. Had the scouts been right, then it would have been fine. We'd still be in the wilderness, sitting in a kollel, surrounded by crowds of glory and studying and getting bread from heaven. There are some people who still feel entitled today that way. But that again is another subject matter here. So they were wrong, and they were seriously wrong, because there is a material world. So what is the ultimate answer? So here we'll go to a verse where the answer is given in the words of Caleb and Joshua. I just want to read it inside. When they respond to the statement that the scouts say that it's a land that consumes its inhabitants, okay? They use these words. Remember, this follows the words that they said. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. So it has to have an answer to that problem. You know, how does materialism, how do we conquer materialism when it is a land that consumes its inhabitants? And they don't deny the fact that it is. You can't deny the facts on the ground. The fact is we see what materialism does to people. So here are their words. They say like this. I mentioned it before. They say, the land that we observed, this is Joshua and Caleb speaking, is an excellent land. It's an exceedingly good land. Teva Oretz Ma'id Ma'id. Very good, very good land. If God desires and wishes for us to enter this land that flows with milk and honey, then there's no question that we can conquer it. But the key thing, they say, is do not rebel and mutineer against God. And do not be driven by fear. And here are the key words I wanted to cite. Kilachmenu heim. Because this land, and it includes, of course, everyone in the land, is our bread and our sustenance. They use the word lachmenu, like bread. This is our bread, our sustenance. And then they go on, they say, and they don't have any power of their own. And since God is with us, do not fear. These are the words they use. In this sentence here, you have one of the most powerful concepts, an absolutely revolutionary approach of Jewish mysticism as opposed to all other schools of mysticism, and particularly in the area of how we deal with this challenge of material life, of a soul trying to survive in a material world. And the key here is not just survive, to thrive, to accomplish a mission that a soul can never accomplish outside of materialism. So I went through exhausted seemingly all the options before. I just want to just sum them up, and then I'll go to explain what this means. Option number one is, listen, stop kidding yourself. This is a material world. Join the club. You want to swim with the sharks, you have to be a shark yourself. And just forget about this idealism. This is the material world we live in. Option two, the other extreme, asceticism. You want to find spiritual integrity, separate yourself from the corruption and competition of this material world. And option number three is compartmentalization. Live in the world, do your best, and compartmentalize. Find weekends, find times that you can carve out for higher aspirations, higher transcendental experiences. What other option could there be? Well, here's the fourth option, and this is what they're saying. It requires looking at the material world in a deeper way. See, all those three options I just said, all are based on as we'll see, a false premise. That materialism is a challenge to the divine, to spirituality. So each of the options comes up with its own solution. One, resign yourself and succumb. The other, escape. And the third, compartmentalize. But here is what the mystics explain. In the words of that the material world has two dimensions to it. On the surface level, yes, it could be a great challenge to anything spiritual. But in truth, the material world itself has a soul. It could also be turned into sustenance. So let me explain this in Kabbalistic terminology. The way the Kabbalists put it is that the material world has divine sparks that give it sustenance. So when you see a table, or a chair, or a Wall Street for that matter, or a business, or money, on the surface level, these are forces that can be very challenging. But they have divine sparks that remain locked and trapped within them to be released. And here's the key line. According to Jewish mysticism, the ultimate way to deal with the tension between matter and spirit is to relieve that tension by releasing the divine sparks that exist within the material world. It's not about escaping to a spiritual oasis, and it's not about giving in or about compartmentalizing. It's realizing that the material world is yours for the taking. That with power you have the ability to transform your material life into a spiritual place. In simpler terms, it means that the key here is not to find a synagogue which to go to on Yom Kippur to escape from the material world. The greatest achievement a person can achieve is to find God in your life, in your daily routines, in your material activities. So that big majority of our lives that is so consumed, as I said earlier, with survival, is not just written off because you find pockets and corners of where you can live transcendently. That part of your life is very much divine energy waiting to be released. And every material activity that we do is an opportunity. It's a spiritual opportunity. But it's trapped. That's the difference. When you're praying on a Yom Kippur in a synagogue, or you're standing in a sacred place by the wall, or some other very spiritual experience, that's not such a big achievement. Because the environment, or the time, or the Shabbat, or the people around you are conducive to a spiritual experience. What God is saying is, I'm sending you into a promised land. That's where you'll find promise, because there lay embedded the deepest sparks of them all. The Kabbalists say, the higher the divine sparks, the lower they fall. Think of it like a wall of stone wall. And you see stones that are scattered near the wall. You know, the farther the stone has fallen from the wall, the higher it was once on the wall. So the things that are greatest fall the farthest places. In this material world, and that's why they say the expression, they didn't say just a good land. They say it's a very good land. Ma'id, ma'id. Because in the spiritual realms, you have spiritual energy. Okay? But in the material world, you have something even more than just spiritual energy. You have divine essential energy. An energy that can only be accessed in the darkest of places. So, think of it like this. The greatest achievements in life come when there's the greatest pressure. You will not extract olive oil from an olive, the Talmud says. You can't extract oil from an olive until you press it. It's symbolic of all pressures in life. We hate pressure, but the pressure brings the best out of us. Deadlines, pressure. Like the tea bag. Eleanor Roosevelt said this, that a woman's like a tea bag. You don't know how strong she is until you put her in hot water. With men, on the other hand, you put them in hot water, they say, ouch, it's hot. You know. I know that's an anti-male statement, but it's the way it is sometimes. So, the innermost strengths of a person's soul are elicited when we coffee break, and that's a technology break. 30 seconds. And this comes to explain the bottom line of why does God rip away a soul from a spiritual environment and thrust it and throw it into this material world, into a physical body. You think of it from the perspective of the soul, it's much easier, not just much easier, infinitely easier to just survive in a spiritual environment. There's no illness, no eating, no sleeping, none of the vices that we have to contend with in this material world. And yet God says, I want the soul to come into a body. Just as God told the Jews there, I want you to go into the promised land, despite what the scouts said that how difficult it is. So there's an interesting argument between Shammai and Hillel in the Talmud that says like this. Is it more pleasant for a person to be born or not to be born? It's somewhat of a, it could be a depressing argument, I guess. And Hillel says it's more pleasant to be born than not to be born. And Shammai says it's more pleasant not to be born than to be born. And actually, even though in most instances the law follows, the ruling follows Hillel, in this case the ruling follows Shammai because he's correct. Life on this earth is not very pleasant. We have pleasant moments. We have ecstatic moments. But if you sum it all up, if you total up most of life, there's more pain, more loss than there is gain, seemingly. And we definitely don't know what's ahead of us. Potentially, this life can lead people to the most darkest places. You know, God should bless us all that life should be minimally painful, but who of us has not had some pain in our lives? It's impossible not to have. So Shammai says it's more pleasant not to be here, because in heaven, souls don't have pain. There's no loss, there's no grief, there's no death, there's no illness. There's none of all the existential challenges and issues that we all deal with does not exist. So that's the case. If Shammai is right, it's more pleasant not to be born than to be born. So why are we here? The answer is pleasant. It's not more pleasant to be born, but meaningful and purposeful is more on this earth than it is in heaven. Because there's no challenge. There's nothing to overcome. So it's natural to be virtuous and giving. What's the accomplishment? Where is something achieved? Where do you break through is in this material world. Because the spiritual sparks and the virtue and beauty lies trapped. We're trapped in the physical universe. You go to work, you meet people. There are people who are backstabbers, duplicitous, thieves, liars, corrupt, greed. And you can never know who's who. Sometimes till it's too late. Even in the best of circumstances, people are always trying to maneuver to dominate a situation. As they say, when a man with money meets a man with experience, The man with experience ends up with the money, and the man with the money ends up with the experience. If that's happening too many times with you, you may need to find another job. So we live in a world, I'm not suggesting that everybody is bad or evil, but potentially we've seen great people fall when the price is right. So we live in a world that is profoundly challenging, not outright dark, and as one of the Kabbalists writes, Arizal says, the wicked prosper. It's a world where evil sometimes can prevail, at least for the short term. Very harsh world. And that's why a soul does not want to come down to this world. It has to be forced to come. Al korcha chatachai, the Mishnah says, that the God decrees and obligates, commands a soul, you must come down to this world. But there's something to be gained, because it is only in this world that we can achieve heights that you can never achieve in the spiritual worlds. But it comes with a challenge. So the Kabbalists put it, they are the highest divine sparks are embedded in the material life that we live. And we are each allocated with a certain amount of sparks. And the places you'll travel to in your life, and your job, and all your material immersions, that land is in essence really bread waiting for you to consume it. But you have to release the sparks. Which means you cannot allow the greed and the selfishness and the narcissism of matter to control you. You have to learn to direct it and channel it toward some type of positive, virtuous end. That's a challenge. The fact that others may not be doing it, the fact that it's difficult because everyone around you is not doing it, that's part of the challenge. So the 10 scouts felt they couldn't do it. But the 2, Joshua and Caleb, said they could. What was their secret? So the secret that they had was, as they keep saying, is because we're connected to the divine. We have the power. We were sent here with the tools. We were not sent alone. Yes, it's a challenging world, but we're not sent unarmed. As the Hasidic expression goes, when you're tied above, you don't fall below. A person in fetters cannot free themselves. When you're trapped in a pit, with a deep pit, you cannot climb out of a pit on your own without someone throwing you a rope. So what we have here, the antidote, is that we come to this world, as challenging as it may be, we come with a soul, and we come with a soul that remains forever connected to its source. We may not feel it, we may not see it. The challenge is to hold on to that for your dear life. That's where faith comes into play. Trust. Connecting to something beyond yourself. Let's apply this even to a very basic thing that we all have to deal with, and we all struggle with, relationships. Do you think there's a relationship that can thrive and survive in this world? I'm talking about loving relationships between husband and wife, spouses. Do you think there's a relationship that can have any permanence if it doesn't have some element of faith in it? There's no such thing as a rational relationship where it's all worked out. Even in businesses with airtight contracts, that can't always be trusted. You only can trust as much as the people themselves. There's always going to be issues. A relationship and love always has an element of trust and faith thrown into there. It doesn't necessarily begin with faith and trust. You have to go through a process of making sure that person is compatible and using your mind and making sure that there's all the elements of compatibility, physical, emotional, intellectual, and so on. But then there is always that element that I've talked about when we discuss relationships, spiritual compatibility. There's always an element of a leap of faith. But you hope that leap comes after you've gone through all the rational gates and checks and balances. If the leap comes before, that's a problem. But it's like everything in life. Your mind and all your tools can help you analyze, process, challenge. But then it leads you to a door and say, well, on paper it all sounds right. I've checked it out. But what will make you enter through that door? It never is a purely rational move. There's always some leap. Except it could be an informed leap, it can be an uninformed leap. That's the difference. But it's always a leap. What do I mean by a leap? Because Because there's always reasons to undermine any relationship. You could always say, how do I know what this potential spouse will be like in 10 years from now? How do I know that if we have certain challenges that we can't even anticipate, that person will be there with me? You can't answer that question. You can only say, I know as best as I know right now. There's no way you can't write the script. Everyone knows, God knows what kind of challenges that are faced in our lives. How do you know what you're going to be like in 5 years from now, and there's some challenge that comes your way that you could never have imagined? But God has blessed us with the ability to develop trust in somebody. What is trust? Trust doesn't mean you have it all worked out exactly. Trust means that all your tools tell you that this is a partner that will be there and be able to deal with the challenges together with you. Can you prove it? Can you say it's absolutely true? No. It has a measure of faith. But it's a faith, as I said, that's informed. Every great move always requires that. Is it a risk? There's a risk. But as all these investment companies like to remind us, the greatest risk is taking no risk. Don't take that to the extreme either. You know, they have other intentions with that. But I'm talking about it on a personal level. So there are ways to process it. That's why the scouts actually went to scout out the land. They didn't just go, God said it's a promised land, enter, and everything will be fine. They went to check it out. Because it's important to know what you're dealing with. Their mistake was not the checking out and not figuring out. The mistake was they came to the conclusion that we can't do it. They should have just known that they will figure out how to do it, not whether you can or you can't. So there's a two-step process to any type of commitment. Another thing, since we're talking about trust, is that a mistake a lot of people make is that they think trust is built on perfection. That if the other person is perfect, then I could trust that person. As if that's possible. Here's the key line. Trust is not built on perfection, it's built on accountability. If you have the other person is accountable, then you could trust them. We all will make mistakes. The question is whether we'll be accountable for our mistakes. Whether we will cover up or we will acknowledge. When you know somebody's ready to be accountable, you can trust them. Because you know, something goes wrong, they'll be there, they'll admit it, they won't cover it up, they won't cover one lie with another lie, which then becomes a vicious cycle of deception. So there are ways that we can cultivate trust. And Caleb and Joshua are basically telling the people, the land is difficult. Everything they said is true, except one thing. We could do it if you remain connected to which is above. So here we are. We live in a material world. No one is suggesting it's not challenging. Nowhere in the Torah does it say it's easy. I remember, you may remember the first of the big bestsellers in the so-called genre of self-help books in the last, this generation was called The Road Less Traveled. And it was like on the best-selling list, Scott Peck, of maybe, 500 weeks, 600 weeks, ridiculous amount of time. I don't know how many people actually read the book, but some say that the first line resonated with everyone, and that's what made it a bestseller. You know what the first line of the book is? Life is difficult. Now, and they could have just read this chapter in the Bible, and they would have also heard that. But he put it that way, life is difficult, and everyone said, oh wow, that's unbelievable. How true, you know? It resonates. But I'm not knocking the book, it happens to be a good book. But, so life is difficult, that is a fact. A soul doesn't want to come down here, kicks and screams, is also a fact. But it comes with tools. And that's the great blessing. You are not a victim, and you're nobody's victim, and you're not vulnerable to anyone if you choose to access your soul and its link, its connection, its power that gives it the energy to overcome any challenge. And not only to overcome any challenge, that wouldn't be enough. Because then what do we achieve? Come to a world of challenge and you don't get destroyed. That's not enough. You have to come out stronger than when you entered. Because the material world is lachmenu heim. It is bread and sustenance for us. When you tap its sparks, it gives your soul strength that the soul would never have on its own. See, that's an amazing concept, because all the other approaches I mentioned before Matter and spirit are two separate worlds. And the question is how you're going to balance them. But what happens when you find out that matter equals spirit, however, it's concealed spirit? Now Einstein, the Jew, I should add, figured it out in physics. E equals mc squared. Energy equals matter. And matter equals energy. Matter is energy. So we all understand if you take a piece of wood, for instance, it begins as inanimate energy. I'm sorry, inanimate matter. And you put it, let's say, in a fire, it becomes fuel. Everyone understands that. Maybe a while back, people didn't relate to that concept, that something can look like one thing and then it can turn into something else, into energy. We all understand that when you take food and put it into your mouth, this food will become energy. It will be digested, broken down. Some will be expelled. But the best part of it will become part of your blood and provide you with vitamins and minerals and other necessities to survive. Someone looks at the food, you don't see it. But it's in there. There's energy in there. And certain foods have different types of energy than others. We all relate to that today. The Torah goes one step further, that every physical activity that you're involved in is also food, is also potential energy. So when you make money, for example, it's not just to give you sustenance so you can buy products, pay rent, or purchase whatever it is that you feel you need or want in your life. Money is energy. And when you give some of it to another through charity, you're actually releasing the sparks. And when you don't, money becomes a narcissistic force that works against you. So strangely enough, hoarding it becomes your own enemy, because then matter and spirit have never connected. The way a person turns their matter into energy is by giving of it. The same is true with every part of our material lives. Every part of it can go two ways. It can be just for you and you alone, or it can be turned into something that is spiritual nature. It's difficult to do, but when you do it, it's so much richer and enriches your life. And that is the ultimate challenge. How do we turn a material world, matter, into spiritual energy? The scouts were terrified of the material. Others just basically resign themselves and succumb to it. And the approach that is ultimately the Torah approach is entering into it with caution, knowing its power, its seductive power, but also knowing you come armed with strength and with faith and with prayer and with connection, commitment. You can turn the entire material world, your corner of the material world, into energy that will make you a stronger and greater person. It's so simple in a way, but it's also so difficult. Look around. Look how hard it is to give charity. People feel like I'm giving away from it. Why would I give something away? So on paper it makes sense what I'm saying here, but the power of material selfishness is so strong it doesn't let you see that it's turned into energy. It would be the equivalent of saying, why should I eat food? I'll save it in the refrigerator. But you know that you won't survive, so you must put it into your mouth, and you must consume it, and you must turn it into energy. In the spiritual, we sometimes think, oh, I'll just hold on to it. The more you hold on to something, the more it will decay, the more materialistic it becomes, the more selfish it becomes, and the more it becomes a burden in your life. So I'm not suggesting being reckless, but charity is considered to be the biggest mitzvah that frees you from the tentacles of material narcissism. And that's exactly why it's so difficult, because we are materialistic, narcissistic creatures, whether we like it or not. And if you weren't, you wouldn't have a problem giving. So that's the best proof. I know you can come up with some theory saying, no, I'm very giving and selfless and all that. Money I hold on to for other reasons. Fine, you can go through whatever excuses you want, justifications. Like the rabbi that gets up and says in the synagogue, we have a big hole in the roof, it's going to cost $100,000. And now here's the bad news and the good news. The good news is that we have the money. The bad news is that it's in your pockets. You know? So I use money specifically because that's maybe the greatest challenge of all. Money symbolizes for us our power, our creativity, our ingenuity, our status, and so on. But precisely because of that, he explains in Tanya, chapter 37, precisely because of that, it is the greatest sustenance of all, lachmenu, it is the bread, but you have to understand it and appreciate it and free. And it's always going to take a battle. It's going to be a big battle. Because materialism is very, very powerful. And it does consume its inhabitants unless you access the soul, which has more power, and let it redeem those sparks. So money on that level. But the truth is, every materialistic activity has that element. You're very hungry, let's say. I don't mean to try to make anyone hungry, but you're hungry. For food, I mean. And you see a piece of food. So your mind tells you don't just grab and eat it because maybe it's dangerous, maybe it's poisonous. The Jewish mind will tell you that also it's not just about you indulging, it's making a blessing, kosher. It's about sensitivity. It's not just about you. It's also about the food. Is the food ready to enter your mouth? So I know we don't think that way. You know, the food doesn't have much choice, you say. But one of the Hasidic Rebbes was once sitting Friday night, the Rebbe Rashab was brought a plate of soup and had noodles in the soup, lakshan, what they call. And he put the noodle in his spoon and it slipped out. You know, sometimes it slips out. It's happened. So most of us just see it as, okay, big thing, you try again. And this Rebbe was said quietly to himself, but he was overheard by his son saying, the noodle isn't ready yet. Because he saw the world as being potential spiritual energy waiting to be released. So there's an apple on a tree waiting for you to come and eat it, make a blessing on it, and sanctify it. But if you use the energy that you get from it to hurt another person, the apple, in its own way, says, what right did you have to tear me off a tree from my natural habitat in order to give you energy to hurt people? Now I'm a partner with you in hurting others. Whereas an apple that it's eaten and the energy is used for something constructive, the apple says to you, thank you. Because had I remained on the tree, I would always remain neutral. I will never have helped another human being. I'll never have helped make this world a better place. Now I'm a partner in that too. So there's a Hasidic aphorism that says that when a wicked person walks on the street, the cobblestones cry out, what right do you have to walk on me? We've never transgressed, the stones say. What right do you have to walk on me? So these are, you could say imaginary conversations, but they have a message. The universe is a platform, is a stage that has profound and very, very powerful energy and divine opportunities and sparks. What it doesn't have is free will. That's up to us. We have the power to redeem these sparks or to imprison them further. Every day, these sparks are waiting for you. Whatever you do, whether it's in your work, whether it's in commuting, even in the things that are completely trivial, you're tying your shoelaces, and so on and so forth. So you could either lose the opportunity and do nothing. You could use the opportunity and squander it by wasting the moment. Or you can release the spark and do something with that moment or opportunity. So at work we have opportunities in who we meet. And the same thing at home and every part of our lives. And this is ultimately the way we create true unity, integration. We relieve the tension between matter and spirit by spiritualizing the material. That is the key line. And that is the message of this chapter. The scouts, we owe them because they provoked the subject and brought it to the surface. But we owe even more to Caleb and Joshua. Joshua remembers the one that leads the Jews into the promised land. Because they understood the secret of what's required. The connection, the faith, the trust. And that leap that one requires to sometimes take on a difficult challenge. So, hopefully, though there's so much more that can be said, hopefully I've shared enough to give us some food for thought and more importantly tools that you have. It's inside of you. You were created with them, you were born with them to overcome any challenge that you have. Remember, a challenge is not just about overcoming it, it's about tapping and transforming it. Everything is an opportunity. even the most difficult things in life. And as I said earlier, it's about projection. They went in, the scouts, and they saw the power of the material universe, and they felt like insects. So then the material universe, of course, looked at them that way too. Joshua and Caleb looked at the world as potential sustenance, potential spiritual energy. So they saw themselves as giants. So nothing could frighten them. So everything they met looked at them with confidence. You'll see people in this world, you have the blind leading the blind. But when you meet somebody with true confidence, it always is contagious. Because it evokes a certain strength when you see people behave in a certain confident way. That could also be manipulative. People do that sometimes to get their way. But it also could be an extremely powerful influence. So it doesn't hurt to be around people that have that type of attitude. In other words, try to hang around with people like Joshua and Caleb more than with the other 10 scouts. I'm sure you can find different examples of it in your Rolodex or whatever, address book. So I want to wish everybody this week to be a week of redeeming your sparks and transforming, not just having spiritual moments. That's one side of things. But more importantly, transforming the material into spiritual opportunities. You cannot imagine what kind of power that has. It's one thing coming to a Torah class or going to a synagogue on Shabbos, but imagine creating a class in your workplace once a week or in your home. Then you take something that on its own would have been completely focused on material gain, you turned it into something spiritual. That's where the greatest transformations take place, and you'll see generate the most power. Much more than when it's compartmentalized. When you transform a meeting, an encounter, someone you meet, a stranger even, into something that's a spiritual thing, you invite them home for a meal, for a Shabbat meal, someone you haven't met before. These things always create magic, much more than the predictable situations. So there are many more examples, and I'm sure you could come up with your own. And I hope that, as I said, I should give you some food, some fuel for thought and action. And as I said, may this universal message of this chapter really empower us all. Look into your own hearts, and you can read some of the verses, and you'll find some of the fears and fright and insecurities of the scouts. You can find it within yourself. But then the key is to also dig and find the Joshua Caleb faith within yourself. Because we have them both. We have both voices. And may the latter prevail. Again, this class is dedicated by Spencer Schneider, a good friend, in honor of everyone who gets uplifted by this class. So now at the end of the class, I hope that's what it achieved. And if anybody's interested in dedicating or sponsoring a class or any of our programs, talk about charity, that's a great opportunity. So if you need to redeem some of your material tentacles, that's a very powerful way to do so. And I will also announce that tomorrow night, Philip will be giving his weekly class. And those of you that have not given us your email address, I appreciate if you did that. First, I send out a weekly email every week, a thought, an idea. This week I'm writing about Spain, 2010, compared to Spain, 1492. I wasn't there in 1492, but I was there in 2010, just this past weekend. An interesting experience in south of Spain. Yes. But if you leave an email address, I'll send you these my weekly thoughts, diatribes, whatever you call it, tantrums, as well as keeping you posted of activities that are going on. Even though I mentioned last week, but we're on the verge of announcing a whole summer series of programs, which are quite diverse. On the 24th, it's final, right? On the 24th, there will be a film screening here called The Human Experience. What time will it be? 8:30? Thursday evening, right? Human Experience, which you can, if you'd like, register, pre-register here if you like for that. And there will also be some other programs that we will announce very shortly in the next few days. Okay. Any other announcements that can be made? We will be here throughout the summer. every Wednesday night, live, 8:15 p.m. And I bid everybody a good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. And as always, it's a great honor to spend time with kindred spirits. Thank you.